harbor district of Veltrack smelled like low tide and diesel, and tonight it smelled like something else. Chris Redfield noticed it the moment the transport dropped him at the perimeter. Not the chemical tang of a standard outbreak. Not the sweet rot signature of early molded. Something between both and neither a biological contamination he couldn't place layered beneath the salt air like a second skin on the city. He pulled his radio and kept moving. "Bravo element is 3 blocks north of the bridge," Martinez said through the earpiece. "We've got infected on the east walkway, but they're not pushing. They're just standing there." "Holding position." "Yes, sir." Chris stopped walking. He looked down the wet avenue toward the harbor lights, the traffic signals cycling red to green over an empty road. Veltrack was a working port on the Adriatic coast, 11,000 residents daily, cargo traffic, 2 ferry terminals. 3 hours ago, the BSAA had received a quarantine request from the Municipal Health Office citing a localized infection event. The initial assessment had rated it a Category 2, containable, likely a legacy strain, manageable with a clean squad. The category rating was already wrong. "Pull your team back to the checkpoint," he said. "Don't engage." "They're not attacking, sir. They're just standing." "Martinez, pull back." A pause. "Copy." Chris moved up to a rooftop access 2 streets from the bridge and climbed. From the 3rd floor of the abandoned cannery, he could see the waterfront in both directions. The long stretch of the main quay to his left, the vehicle bridge to his right, and directly below the street grid of the port district running toward the residential blocks. He counted infected at 6 separate intersections. None of them were moving erratically. None were feeding. Most were clustered near natural choke points, the base of the bridge ramp, the mouth of the alley that led toward the ferry terminal, the steps outside a parking structure that overlooked 2 major roads simultaneously. He keyed his radio again. "Jill." "I see it from here," she said. Her voice was even, no tension in it. She had a better angle. She'd positioned herself on the east side of the district 20 minutes before the main element arrived. "They're holding the bridge. 3 on the north end, 2 on the approach. The one near the railing is watching the road, not reacting to light or sound." "That's not standard behavior." "No," she agreed. "It's not." Chris exhaled slowly through his nose and studied the infected near the bridge ramp. Jill was right. The one near the railing wasn't stumbling, wasn't drawn by stimulus, wasn't locked into the blind hunt pattern that every strain in the BSAA database described. It was oriented. Its head moved at intervals, scanning, not searching. Like something was directing its attention. He'd been in Raccoon City. He'd faced Magini Ganados molded Plagas hosts in every documented configuration. None of them had held a defensive line. "Rebecca," he said. "What have you got?" Rebecca Chambers answered from the mobile analysis unit 2 blocks south of the perimeter. "The pathogen doesn't match anything in the database. It's not a retrovirus. It's not mold. There's a secondary compound I can't identify, but what it's doing to the tissue is the part that worries me." A brief pause. "I'm seeing coordinated electrical activity across samples taken from separate individuals. They weren't near each other when they were collected." Chris stared at the cluster near the bridge. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning they're not just infected the same way. They're receiving the same signal." He said nothing for a moment. The rain had picked up slightly, a thin drizzle that turned the harbor lights into smeared reflections across the pavement. Down at the base of the bridge, one of the infected turned its head toward the sound of a distant car alarm, then turned away. Not interested. Still watching the road. "We're not dealing with a standard outbreak," he said. He wasn't reporting it. He was confirming something he'd already decided. "No," Rebecca said quietly. "I don't think we are." He climbed back down from the cannery and rejoined Martinez's four-man element at the checkpoint. They were professionals. Nobody was visibly rattled, but the stillness of the figures out there had gotten into the air between them in the way that things do when a pattern refuses to make sense. Chris gave the briefing in flat, direct sentences. Blocked bridge, coordinated positioning, unknown strain. Rules of engagement: do not initiate contact with the hosts. Hold the perimeter, keep the evacuation corridors to the residential sector clear. If the clusters began moving toward the civilian blocks, extraction protocols activated immediately. He sent Martinez's element west toward the ferry terminal approach and took the southern block himself. For 40 minutes, nothing changed. The carriers maintained their positions through rain and noise, and the passing of a stray dog that would have sent any standard pattern host into a feeding frenzy. Chris moved between observation points and tracked the clusters on his tactical map, building a picture that refused to look like an accident. The cluster at the parking structure had split. Two remained at the entrance steps. One had moved to the roof access, which gave line of sight over the entire southern approach to the residential district. He was on the radio to Jill when the lights went out. Not the street lights, not the harbor floods. The lights inside the old industrial building 4 blocks south of the waterfront, the one that had shown low-level power activity all evening. The one that the municipal authority had listed as a disused refrigeration facility. Every window went dark at once, and then seconds later, the faint vibration in the ground that Chris associated with heavy machinery powering down rippled through the soles of his boots. "You feel that?" Jill asked. "Yeah." That came from underground. He was already moving. He cut south through a service alley past dumpsters and coiled cable and the rusted shell of a pallet loader and reached the perimeter fence of the industrial site in under 2 minutes. The facility was larger than its footprint suggested. The main building was 3 stories of corrugated steel and concrete, but the loading dock at the rear showed vehicle access points that descended below grade level. Somebody had been using the sub-levels, and recently. The tire marks on the wet concrete were fresh. He found the access stairwell behind the second loading bay and went down. Martinez's element was committed to the western approach. Pulling anyone back now meant leaving the ferry terminal corridor unguarded, and the residential blocks sat directly behind it. Chris had called it in, marked the location on the shared map, and told Martinez to hold position. If there were survivors in the sub-level waiting, meant losing them. If there was evidence waiting, meant losing that too. The power was out below, but emergency strips along the baseboards threw a faint amber wash over the corridor. The air was colder. It carried a chemical smell that Rebecca would have named in seconds, something sterile cutting through something biological, like a hospital that had given up trying. Chris moved with his rifle up, clearing each intersection before he advanced. He reached what had been a control room. The screens were dead. Several workstations had been evacuated in a hurry chairs, pushed back hard, a coffee mug still upright, a clipboard on the floor. He scanned the room and found the door to the intersection. It was reinforced biometric and currently hanging open. Someone had breached it from the inside. The metal of the frame was deformed. Not cut, not blown, deformed, like the door had been struck with tremendous force from within, and the lock assembly had simply ceased to matter. Chris looked at the bent steel and the depth of the impression and made a quick, quiet calculation. Nothing in the BSAA threat catalog produced that specific pattern. Not Tyrant class, not Nemesis type. Not anything he could immediately categorize. He filed it and moved through. The corridor beyond was short. It ended at a junction, and the junction told the story. Left branch led to what had been storage, right branch to a large chamber that the floor plan would have labeled as an equipment bay. Chris took the right branch. What he found in the equipment bay had been a laboratory. Past tense, definitively. The workbenches had been overturned. The containment units along the far wall, 8 of them built to house large biological specimens, had been forced open from inside. Claw marks on the inner glass. Biological residue and bodies. 6 of them, all in tactical gear that didn't match any BSAA unit or known PMC configuration. Whatever organization had equipped these people, it had resources and it had reasons to keep them quiet. Chris checked each body long enough to confirm fatality and moved on. The chamber beyond was sealed. Or had been. The door was on the floor. He stood in the entrance and looked at what remained of the room. And for a long moment, he simply cataloged detail after detail without reaching for a conclusion. The door on the floor bowed outward, still attached to its frame, the entire assembly ripped from the wall. The emergency lighting in this room not damaged, but switched to a different mode, lower redder. The sealed cylinder in the center of the room, roughly 2 meters tall, built into the floor with mounting hardware that suggested it had been there for some time. The mounting hardware was now bent, 2 bolts sheared entirely. Whatever had been in that cylinder was gone. Chris raised Jill on the radio. "I'm at the sub-level of the industrial site South Block. Somebody was running a facility down here. Containment units, labs, tactical personnel. Everything's been cleared out, either evacuated or eliminated." He paused. "There's a primary containment unit in the central chamber. It's been breached. From the inside." Jill's voice came back after a 2-second silence. "Define breached." "The mounting bolts are sheared. The door to the outer room is on the floor. The door to the corridor beyond that is bent off its frame." He looked at the steel again. "Jill, whatever was in here left under its own power and went through 2 reinforced doors on the way out." Another pause. When Jill spoke, her voice had the quality it always took on when she was pulling a thread. She didn't like the feel of not alarmed, just precise. "Does the facility connect to an exit north of the bridge?" Chris pulled the floor plan Rebecca had sent during the transit. He traced the sub-level corridor. It ran north. "Yes." "Then something came up from there about 20 minutes ago and walked through the port district," Jill said. "I've been tracking movement on the far side of the bridge. Whatever it is, it's not drawn to noise, it's not feeding, and it's moving north in a straight line, same way you'd clear a route if you knew where you were going. That's not carrier behavior. That's not anything in the catalog." He looked at the bent door one more time, at the sheared bolts, at the depth of the deformation in the steel which spoke to a kind of force that didn't fit inside the standard vocabulary of threats he carried with him. "Hold your position," he told her. "Keep eyes on it." "Already am." Chris stood alone in the red-lit chamber in the wreckage of a facility nobody was supposed to know existed, and understood that the situation had just stopped being a standard outbreak. Whatever the BSAA had been sent to contain it was not the most dangerous thing in Veltrack tonight. 3 blocks north, past the bridge, where the carriers still held their silent perimeter, something moved through the dark with purpose that had nothing to do with hunger. And the carriers, every one of them, at every intersection, at every choke point they had held for hours, turned their heads away from it as it passed. Not reacting, not attacking, clearing a path. The way animals clear a path for something they have no category for. But down at the edge of the harbor, inside a guard post that the Black Archive had established 3 weeks ago behind the false front of a shipping logistics company, a technician pulled up the last 30 seconds of camera footage from the sub-level corridor and watched the feed twice before he found his voice. "Control," he said. "Containment is breached. Unit is mobile." The voice on the other end was measured. No panic. "What is the classification of the unit?" The technician looked at the footage again. The shape in the corridor. the weight of every footfall registering as a flex in the subflooring. The way the emergency lighting caught the surface of what it wore, something armored layered, built for war, in a way that had nothing to do with anything manufactured in the last century. The shape had walked past 6 of their Type 3 containment specimens without breaking stride. The specimens, which had torn through reinforced polymer on 3 separate occasions during testing, had pressed themselves flat against the back walls of their cages as it passed. "We cataloged it as a legacy artifact," the technician said. "A recovered war asset from a pre-organization acquisition. The intake files said it was dormant. And now..." The technician watched the footage a 3rd time. The shape had stopped at the 2nd door, had stood there for exactly 1 second, facing the bent steel. Then it had put its hand against the frame and pushed, and the door had left the wall entirely. "It's active," the technician said, "and it's already on the surface." The first thing he registered was the smell. Not the brimstone and char of hell's processing floors, not the argent sweet burn of corruption eating through organic matter. This was chemical cold, precise preservatives over decay, antiseptic, over something that had been alive recently and wasn't anymore. The smell of a place that had been doing things to living creatures for a long time and saw no reason to stop. He was upright before full awareness caught up with him. The cylinder that had held him was open, the seal broken from outside, the mounting hardware still locked to the floor. Around his boots, the upper casing pushed back on its hydraulic arm. Someone had opened the container, expecting to find what the intake manifest described: a dormant asset. A relic. A thing to be cataloged and studied, and eventually field-tested on a schedule that suited the people holding the keys. He looked at the room. The chamber was large, low-ceilinged, lit by strips of blue-white fluorescence that gave every surface the quality of a dissection table. Along the left wall, a row of transparent enclosures ran floor to ceiling, 8 of them, each large enough to house something that had once been significantly more dangerous than a human being. 5 were occupied. The things inside them pressed against the polymer walls and watched him with the attentive flat hunger of creatures that understood threat assessment in only one direction. He turned right. The workbenches held what the people running this place had built from what they had salvaged. Tissue cultures in sealed trays, cross-referenced with incident reports he couldn't read, but recognized by their formatting the language of organizations that documented atrocities in bureaucratic fonts. Photographs pinned above the benches showed outbreak sites he had not seen but understood immediately. Collapsed buildings, mass graves under tarps, field autopsies conducted in rain. Next to the photographs projected on a glass panel from a hard drive that was still running a cellular model, rotated slowly. It was not a model of something natural. He knew what this was. He had seen the architecture of corruption in enough forms across enough worlds to recognize it when it wore different clothes. This was a place that took the worst things that had ever happened to human beings and asked how to make them happen again more efficiently on command. The Praetor's suit registered the sublevel's dimensions as he moved toward the first door, reinforced approximately 40 meters of structure between him and open air. The door itself was a standard blast-rated panel, the kind designed to contain pressure events, not to stop anything that had already decided it was leaving. He hit it once flat-palmed. The impact rang through the whole frame. The locking assembly sheared, and the panel swung hard into the opposite wall, denting it. The passage beyond opened into a wider operational section. Here the lighting was red emergency strips, activated by whatever had tripped when the cylinder seal released. 4 soldiers in unmarked tactical gear were moving in a 2x2 formation toward the chamber he'd just vacated. They had suppressors on their rifles and the practiced spacing of people who had done room clearance before. The lead man raised a fist, and the formation halted. They had been expecting something large and confused. The lead soldier brought his weapon up and got one round off before the Doomblade took his rifle arm at the elbow. The formation broke immediately, exactly the right call, because standing still in the same space as what they were facing would have killed all four of them in the first 3 seconds instead of the first 8. The second soldier went for the door frame to his left for cover, which put the frame itself between them. He pulled the super shotgun from the magnetic mount at his back and discharged it through the frame. The door frame ceased to be useful cover. The third soldier was running. That was also the right call. He let him go. The fourth had activated a radio. "Contact in sub-level 3. The asset is mobile. We need heavy." The radio stopped transmitting. He moved through the operational section without pausing. The layout opened up as he went deeper. This was the working heart of the facility where the actual construction happened. Biological assembly stations with robotic arms still parked in standby positions. Culture vats the size of small vehicles, each one opaque with whatever was growing inside. More of the containment enclosures lining the walls here. These ones larger, built for specimens that needed more room to express whatever had been done to them. A klaxon fired, then cut off, then fired again in a different tone. The sound of a system trying to decide which alarm category applied to what was currently happening in its building. Through the far wall of the assembly floor, something moved. It hit the wall from the inside, and the wall reinforced polymer over steel plate rated for containment of Class 4 biological events, buckled outward. The second impact tore a seam in the polymer. The third brought the entire panel section down in a collapse of composite material and twisted support railing. What came through was not the largest thing he had ever killed. It stood roughly 3 meters at the shoulder. Its original humanoid structure buried under layers of biomass that Black Archive's assembly floor had grafted onto its frame over what had clearly been a long and unpleasant development period. Chains of synthetic muscle ran along its outer casing and visible cables. Its skull had been plated with a ceramic compound that gave its head the flat, eyeless quality of a construction tool. Both forearms had been replaced entirely with articulated crushing limbs that left grooves in the flooring with each step. It oriented on him by sound and thermal signature, both of which the Praetor suit was already managing. He let it close to 8 meters. It raised one of the crushing limbs for a downward strike. He sidestepped left and put the super shotgun under its extended arm at point-blank range and fired twice in under a second. The first round opened the synthetic muscle along its flank. The second went into the gap. The thing staggered, which gave him the angle he needed. He drove the Doomblade up through the ceramic plating at the base of its neck, found the original biological structure underneath, and carved through it with the kind of efficiency that came from understanding exactly how much force a given material required and applying precisely that much no more. It went down in 4 seconds from first contact. He stood over it for a moment, not catching breath, not assessing injury, because the suit had already done both and returned clean results. He was reading the construction. The grafting work was sophisticated. Whoever had built this had access to legacy BOW architecture and the engineering capability to iterate on it. They had taken something that was already dangerous and made it more dangerous in ways that required both resources and knowledge. That meant more of them existed somewhere. And it meant someone had been doing this for long enough to get good at it. He filed that and kept moving. The rest of the complex took 11 minutes. Not because of resistance, Black Archive had deployed 2 more strike elements and a second heavy unit in that time, and none of them had meaningfully slowed his progress. The 11 minutes came from the layout itself, from the need to push through 4 distinct areas of the sub-level, the assembly floor, the data processing wing, the storage corridor, and the logistics hub, where the installation connected to its surface access points. 2 kilometers away in the mobile analysis unit, parked south of Veltrax's perimeter, Rebecca Chambers watched a biometric feed collapse in Block's 12 biosignatures in the sub-level, dropping off the monitor in under 9 minutes. She pulled the data twice to confirm it wasn't a sensor fault. It wasn't. She keyed her radio. "Chris? Something is moving through that building from the bottom up. Whatever it is, it's not leaving survivors." No response. Chris was already underground. In the data processing wing, he passed a bank of active terminals and noted that several were mid-operation file transfers running biological models, rendering incident data cross-referenced with outcome projections. Someone had been doing live analysis when the alarms activated. He found the primary server housing bolted to the floor under a secondary blast panel, pulled the panel off its hinges, and looked at the drive array for approximately 2 seconds. Then he brought the heel of the Predator suit's boot down on it. Once was not enough. The second impact flattened the housing. The third left it unrecognizable as anything that had ever stored data. The incubation wing was where the installation kept what it hadn't finished yet. The enclosures here were smaller growth units rather than containment cells. Most held things in intermediate development stages, shapes recognizably neither what they had started as, nor what they were being built toward. He moved through without stopping. The things inside watched him pass, and several went quiet in a way that suggested something older and more basic than the conditioning they'd been subjected to had just recognized something in the room with them. He put the chainsaw through the environmental control panel at the section's far end. The temperature in the incubation units would drop below viable range within the hour. In the logistics hub, he found the surface access a vehicle ramp that rose at a shallow angle toward a loading bay that the facility's cover company had been using for legitimate cargo movement. The ramp was wide enough for a heavy transport. He went up it and emerged into open air for the first time since waking. The rain had not let up. The harbor lights were visible 4 blocks north. He stood at the top of the ramp for a moment, reading the city. The sounds of it, the movement of the carriers visible at the far end of the access road, the lights in the buildings beyond. The source of what was wrong here wasn't out in those streets. It was somewhere deeper in. He turned north and began moving. Chris reached the sub-level access 18 minutes after the last transmission from Black Archive's internal radio net went silent. He came down with Martinez and one other. He'd pulled them from the western tether point after the ground vibration from below had registered on their equipment twice in rapid succession, accompanied by sounds that Martinez had described as something heavy being destroyed repeatedly. Chris hadn't disagreed with the assessment. He'd also not been waited for backup from outside the perimeter, because whatever was generating those sounds was already finished generating them by the time he reached the loading bay. The ramp down was wide and lit from below by red emergency strips. He went first. Martinez took the left wall. Reyes took the right. The logistics hub at the bottom was intact. Structurally, the bodies of 2 tactical personnel Black Archive, based on the unmarked gear, were against the far wall in positions that suggested they had been moving and then stopped moving very quickly. The blast panel over the server housing had been torn off and was on the floor. The server array beneath it was compressed into itself. Chris moved through the hub into the incubation wing and stopped at the entrance. He had been in places like this before. The BSAA's after-action documentation from Kijuju, from the Tall Oaks aftermath, from the marine salvage operation in the Baltics, all of it had trained him to read a space the way a doctor reads a body. What was still there? What wasn't? What the damage said about whatever had caused it. The enclosures were intact. That was the first thing. Dozens of growth units, each housing something in an intermediate development state, and none of them breached. Whatever had come through here made a deliberate choice not to open them. The environmental control panel at the far end was destroyed. Chris crouched and traced what had happened to it. The temperature displays on the nearest units read dropping. Whatever had hit the panel had known exactly what it controlled. "Sir," Martinez said quietly from the doorway. Chris stood up. "I see it. That's not BOW behavior. None of this is. No." Chris looked at the line of incubation units, at the careful path of destruction that had gone through this room, touching exactly what needed to be touched and nothing else. "It's not." They moved through into the assembly floor and Chris stopped again. The heavy specimen was on the floor near the center of the room. Chris walked around it in a slow circle rifle held low, taking in the construction. The grafted biomass, the ceramic plating, the articulated crushing limbs that were still twitching with residual nerve activity. He knew what this was. He had seen the source material. The lineage went back to the T103 line, heavily modified years of iterative work piled onto an already dangerous base chassis. The BSAA had a threat rating for something like this. The rating involved evacuation of a minimum 4-block radius and a dedicated engagement team of no fewer than 6 operators with anti-armor ordnance. The thing had been killed in under 30 seconds. Chris could read the timeline from the blood pattern and the damage distribution. Under 30 seconds, and the engagement had started at close range, and whatever had done it had walked away without breaking stride. He stood in the middle of the assembly floor of an installation that had been operational an hour ago, and looked at what was left of it and understood that the standard vocabulary he carried for categorizing threats had just become partially obsolete. Martinez was on the radio calling it in. Reyes was documenting the growth units. Chris was looking at the far wall, at the hole where the heavy unit had come through, at the twisted railing and collapsed composite panel, and he was thinking about the containment cylinder in the chamber at the other end of the complex. What did they have in that thing? Martinez asked from somewhere behind him. Chris thought about the sheared bolts, the 2 reinforced panels that had been moved out of the way rather than destroyed. The incubation units left sealed in a room full of things that posed an ongoing biological hazard. The server array targeted and rendered inoperable before anything else in the data wing was touched. "I don't know," he said, but it knew what it was doing. And on the surface, 3 kilometers east of the harbor district, Elena Vargas sat in the back seat of an armored vehicle and watched the combat footage on a tablet. She had watched it 4 times. She would watch it several more before she reached any conclusion worth stating. The footage was from the assembly floor camera, the only one that had maintained a clean signal through the full engagement. 41 seconds of recording. It showed the heavy construct breach the wall orient approach, and then encounter the subject. It showed the subject move. It showed the engagement resolve. Elena had designed the heavy construct herself. She had overseen its development through 14 iterations. She knew its threat profile down to the individual performance metrics. It had been rated to hold a structural choke point against an engagement team of 8 for a minimum of 6 minutes, 41 seconds of footage. The man in the armored suit had not run. He had not retreated to a better position or attempted to use the room's geography to his advantage. He had stood his ground and moved forward, and the engagement had been over before the specimen's second strike landed. The subordinate in the front seat was waiting for an order. "Disengage any active pursuit," Elena said. "Director, we still have elements in the area that could recall them." She watched the footage again. She watched the subject step over the specimen's body without looking down at it. She watched him read the server housing through the blast panel, remove the panel and make a decision in 2 seconds that her data recovery team would spend the next 72 hours trying to reverse. "Don't send anything else after it tonight." "Then what do we do?" Elena set the tablet down on her knee screen, still running. Outside the vehicle's window, the lights of Veltrack moved past in the rain, still lit, still running, still unaware of what had just walked out of a hole in the ground beneath its industrial district. we find out what it is, she said. Where it goes, what it prioritizes. She paused. We have been operating under the assumption that the asset was a conventional war relic, high durability, high lethality, limited strategic cognition. That assumption is no longer supportable. She picked up the tablet again and advanced the footage to the incubation wing, to the environmental panel, to the 2-second pause before the subject destroyed it. Something that understands what it's killing and why is worth considerably more attention than something that simply kills. The subordinate said nothing. Track it, Elena said. Don't intercept. She watched the footage loop back to the beginning. The subject stepping out of the cylinder, the way it stood still for exactly long enough to read the room. The direction it turned first, not toward the exit, not toward the soldiers, but toward the workbenches where the incident photographs were pinned above the culture trays. It had looked at the photographs. Elena kept that detail to herself for now, but she filed it in the careful, organized way. She filed everything that didn't fit her current model, not discarded, not resolved. Simply held in place until enough other information arrived to tell her what shape the revision needed to take. The company was called Helix Meridian Logistics. It had a registered office in Trieste, a secondary address in Zagreb, and on paper it moved refrigerated pharmaceutical cargo between 6 Adriatic ports. In practice, it had moved something else entirely, and Jill Valentine had been pulling at that thread for 4 hours. She was in the back room of a print shop, 2 streets from Helix Meridian's Veltrac branch office. A branch office that had gone dark 40 minutes ago, its staff apparently deciding simultaneously that they had somewhere else to be. The print shop's owner had been quietly escorted out by Rebecca 20 minutes prior. Now, it was just Jill, a laptop running a decryption tool she'd built from 3 separate open-source packages and a growing map of financial transfers that didn't behave like pharmaceutical logistics. The routing's wrong, she said. Rebecca looked up from the portable analysis unit she'd set up on the cutting table. How wrong? Wrong enough to mean it was never pharmaceutical. Jill traced 3 lines on the screen with her finger. Cold chain moves in cycles, fixed intervals, documented clearance, regulated routes. These transactions are short notice, high value point-to-point, no cycles. No documentation trail worth a damn. She pulled up a second window without waiting for a response. And every wire originates from the same 4 accounts. All registered to shell companies incorporated within a 6-week window 3 years ago. Someone built an infrastructure in 6 weeks. Someone built a lot of things in a hurry 3 years ago. Jill opened the property overlay full screen. 14 locations, 6 countries. The pattern across the map was not random coastlines, port approaches, industrial districts next to municipal infrastructure. Places where sub-level construction could run for months without drawing an inspector. And they built it so it wouldn't look like what it is until someone who knew what to look for spent 4 hours staring at it. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had slackened to a drizzle that left the streets looking like wet cement. So the money trail goes back further than the outbreak. 3 years further. Whatever Black Archive is, it didn't appear because of a single bad decision. It was built. She closed the window and left the property map on screen. And it was built to last. Rebecca turned back to the samples she'd been processing since they arrived. She had 4 of them, tissue draws from the 2 carriers BSAA, had managed to sedate and isolate during the initial perimeter push a culture scraping from the sub-level lab's vat residue that Chris had collected before the site was locked down, and a blood sample from one of the Black Archive soldiers, whose body hadn't been removed when the installation was evacuated. She had been running comparative analysis on all 4 for 3 hours. "I need you to hear something," Rebecca said. Jill turned her chair. "The carrier samples and the vat residue share a base architecture. Rebecca pulled up the model on her own screen, a rotating structure that looked at first glance like a standard pathogen cross-section. That's not unusual. If Black Archive sourced their strain from existing material, you'd expect overlap. But the overlap here isn't at the base level. It's at the command layer. She highlighted a cluster of molecular structures in a different color. This part isn't infectious in the traditional sense. It doesn't spread between hosts. It receives. Jill looked at the screen. Receives what? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. She looked at the model for another 2 seconds, long enough that the silence had a weight to it, and then she said, "Instructions." She said the word like she'd been hoping, right up until she had to say it, that she was wrong. Whatever the signal mechanism is, it's not driven by blind biological imperative, the way every documented pathogen works. The carriers aren't moving toward food sources or heat signatures. They're responding to something external and centralized. She paused. I've been trying to tell myself this is a plaga variant or a mold network analog. Neither fits. The architecture is different. Nobody has built this before. So Black Archive didn't adapt something old. They combined things that shouldn't be combined and gave the result a way to receive orders. Rebecca pulled up a secondary chart timeline data, which means every carrier in this city isn't running on instinct. And if that central signal ever gets complex enough, ever accumulates enough data from enough real engagements. She stopped. It learns, Jill said. It updates, iterates, gets better at using what it has. Rebecca's voice was flat and even, the register she used when the data had gone somewhere she didn't want to follow it. Jill, if Black Archive completes this system, every future outbreak they seed won't just be dangerous. It'll be trained. It'll know from day one what works and what doesn't, because the command layer will have already run the numbers on this city. The room was quiet for a moment. The decryption tool on Jill's laptop finished a pass and surfaced 3 new transfer records. Jill looked at them. Then she looked at the property map. Then she picked up her radio. Chris? Go ahead. His voice was rough. He'd been on the outer perimeter for 6 hours. The site last night wasn't a headquarters. It was a branch. Black Archive has at least 13 other locations on this map, probably more I haven't found yet. Whatever we stopped last night, we stopped one piece of it. A pause. How big is the central piece? I don't know yet, but I know they're already pulling data and samples out of the smaller sites. The financial activity in the last 8 hours shows emergency transfer patterns fast. Irregular, no documentation. They're consolidating. She watched a new data point appear on the transfer map, a wire originating from a logistics account in Split, terminating at an account she hadn't seen before with a routing code that didn't match any of the others. And they're routing the important material somewhere that isn't on any map I've accessed yet. Another pause. When Chris spoke, his voice had the particular quality it took on when he was recalculating a situation he'd already categorized. Leon's 40 minutes out. I'll redirect him. Tell him to come ready. If Black Archive is moving assets, whoever's carrying them won't want company. She put the radio down and looked at the new routing code. Somewhere in the city, or just outside it, a box of something important was on its way to somewhere Black Archive considered worth protecting. That meant data, biological material they couldn't rebuild from scratch, or both. Either way, it was a thread that led somewhere more central than anything she'd found in the financial records. She was still building the trace when Rebecca said quietly from behind her, "We have a problem." Jill didn't look up from the screen. "How close?" "Close enough that I can hear the vehicle." Rebecca was already breaking down her analysis unit, practiced efficient, no wasted motion. Black Archive must have flagged the Helix Meridian access point. They know someone's been in the system. Jill copied the routing code, the property map, and everything she'd pulled from the financial architecture onto a portable drive in 11 seconds. She pulled the drive, closed the laptop, and stood. Back exit. Alley, covered. They were out of the print shop 40 seconds before the cleanup team came through the front. Jill heard the door go as they hit the far end of the alley-controlled entry, not a crash, which meant the team was professional. They weren't coming in to make noise. They were coming in to find out how much had been accessed and make sure it couldn't be used. Jill filed that. Black Archive's response time from the flag to boots on the ground had been under 12 minutes. That wasn't a local team improvising. That was pre-positioned personnel waiting for exactly this kind of activation. They weren't just protecting assets. They had a cleanup infrastructure running in parallel the entire time. Elena Varga had not slept. She had not needed to. She had long since trained herself to treat rest as a scheduling variable rather than a biological requirement, which was one of the habits she shared with the system she was building, whether or not she'd intended the parallel. She was in the secondary command vehicle, now parked in an industrial lot on the eastern edge of Veltrack, watching the overnight reports from 7 surviving operations compile on the screen in front of her. 3 of those outposts had already gone to radio silence on her instruction. 2 others had begun their evacuation protocols. The Veltrack primary was gone. 6 years of work in this city. Gone in 11 minutes. She did not dwell on it. Loss was informative. Loss was the gap between model and reality, and the correct response to a gap was not grief, it was revision. The BSAA has been accessing Helix Meridian's financial architecture. Her operations lead reported from the front of the vehicle, originating from a terminal in the Veltrack district. Probably a field analyst. Jill Valentine, Elena said without looking up from her screen. A brief pause. How did you? She's the only BSAA-affiliated analyst currently in the city, with the capability and the clearance to run that kind of decryption in the field. Elena scrolled to the next report. What has she accessed? Transaction records, property registrations. We flagged a cross-reference attempt against the split routing at 0340. So she knows we're moving material. Elena set down her stylus. This was the variable she had been expecting, not the speed of it, but the fact of it. Good people given enough time with enough data would find the shape of the thing. She had known Jill Valentine's name since the Arclay incident files. She had been prepared for this. What is the status of the split movement? En route. Estimated delivery to the mountain facility in 7 hours. Accelerate it. Close the split account after the cargo clears. She picked up the stylus again. And send a cleanup team to whatever access point she used. I want to know what she copied before they arrived. She said it the way she might say, close the window. Not cruelty, not indifference, simply the voice of someone for whom the question of whether people got out of the way in time was a logistics consideration, not a moral one. What is the current position of the asset? The operations lead consulted his board. Last confirmed sighting was northwest of the Harbor District 4 hours ago. 2 of our exterior monitoring posts have gone dark since then. We believe it is moving, but we have not maintained consistent track. Elena looked at the assembly floor footage again. She had pulled it up on a secondary screen and let it run on loop while she worked the way some people kept music in the background. 41 seconds. She had now watched it 63 times and was still extracting information from it. It had looked at the photographs before doing anything else. That was the first thing she had revised her model around. Not a BOW, reflex. Not an animal threat assessment scan. Something more deliberate, the behavior of an entity that wanted to understand what it was destroying before it destroyed it. The second data point was the server housing. It had not destroyed the first server it passed. It had moved through the data wing, assessed the layout, identified the primary housing, and prioritized that target above everything else in the room. That kind of discrimination required either significant intelligence or significant experience with the specific threat a data core represented. The third data point, the one she had not shared with anyone, was the chain of decisions in the incubation wing. Not a single growth unit opened. It had destroyed the environmental system and walked away, letting temperature do the work, because opening the units would have released biological material into the building and potentially beyond. A calculation about collateral impact resolved in favor of the method that contained the damage. It was operating with something that looked uncomfortably like principles. That made it significantly more dangerous than anything she had planned for. A weapon with no principles could be modeled. A weapon with principles had limits she hadn't mapped yet, and unmapped limits were gaps in her understanding of the threat. Increase the buffer around the mountain facility, she said, not to intercept, to buy time for evacuation if it locates the site before we're ready. She closed the footage window and pulled the signal data from the 3 silenced outposts before the caches expire. I want that material regardless of what else we lose tonight. Director. The operations lead hesitated. If the asset continues at its current rate, we may lose more than 3 sites by morning. Elena looked at her map. At the 14 locations, at the 3 already dark, at the money moving toward a mountain she had not put on any document the BSAA could access. I know, she said. That's why the mountain has to be ready before morning. So, Rebecca sent her final analysis to the BSAA secure channel at 0418 and sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of a doorway alcove 2 blocks from the print shop. The portable unit balanced on her knees, the cold coming up through the concrete. She had written the conclusion 3 times each time, finding a more precise way to say the same thing. The final version was 11 sentences long. The last 2 were the ones that mattered. This is not a novel pathogen event. This is a weapon system in active deployment, using existing biological material as its substrate and a purpose-built command architecture as its operational layer. If that architecture reaches full capacity before it is disrupted at the source, every subsequent outbreak seeded by this organization will enter the field pre-trained. The learning curve will not start at 0. It will start wherever this engagement leaves off. She read it back once more. Then she forwarded it to Chris, to Leon's incoming channel, and to Jill, who was crouched 3 feet away, watching the alley entrance with her hand near her holster, and who would read it in approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds later, Jill read it. She didn't say anything. She pocketed her radio and looked back at the alley, and Rebecca could see her working through it, not the biology which Jill trusted Rebecca to have right, but the operational implication. A system that learned. A system that was already learning right now from the carriers, still holding positions in the streets above them. Rebecca watched her think and thought about the 14 dots on the property map, and thought about what it meant that the site destroyed. Last night, the one that had taken 11 minutes was already being described in Black Archive's internal documentation from the fragment she'd intercepted before the print shop went loud as a tertiary branch. Tertiary. She pulled her jacket tighter and kept that word to herself because saying it out loud would not make the situation more manageable, and the situation was going to need managing very soon. The freight yard south of Veltrax's cargo terminal ran for half a kilometer along the waterfront stacked cargo blocks. Crane rails, the constant low groan of refrigeration units, keeping whatever was inside them at whatever temperature it needed to be kept. At this hour, 3 in the morning, the legitimate handlers had gone home. The yard was running on skeleton staff and automated systems, which was exactly the kind of environment that made moving something sensitive very easy, if you had the right access codes, and very difficult if you didn't. Leon Kennedy had neither, which was why he went over the fence. He dropped into a crouch behind a steel block and pulled up the yard map Jill had pushed to his tablet 20 minutes ago. The split routing code had resolved to a logistics company called Adriamed Cold Chain, registered out of Zagreb, whose refrigeration manifest for tonight listed 3 outbound units bound for a road hub outside the city. The manifest was clean. Too clean, the kind of clean that came from someone who understood how to make documentation invisible by making it look exactly like everything around it. He moved east along the cargo rows, staying low. The yard had 2 visible security patrols. He'd clocked them from the perimeter, but it also had a 3rd set of footprints in the wet gravel near the eastern crane that didn't belong to either pattern. Somebody else was already in the yard. He didn't stop to figure out who. He kept moving. The 3 Adriamed units were at the far end of the eastern block, already on flatbed trailers, engines running on the trucks attached to them, ready to roll the moment someone gave the word. Leon looked at the trucks and thought about what Rebecca had confirmed 20 minutes ago in a message that used the phrase viable biological payload in a way that made it clear she was being precise rather than cautious. Viable meant alive. Alive meant whatever was in those boxes could still be used. He picked the middle unit. Statistically, decoys went on the outside. He was 4 meters from the trailer when the shot came, a single suppressed round that clipped the corner of the housing above his left shoulder and sent a spark of metal into his cheek. He was already moving, rolling right, putting the trailer's chassis between himself and the angle the shot had come from. A second round hit the gravel where he'd been crouched. Overwatch. East crane structure elevated, which meant they'd had somebody up there before the column was loaded. They'd anticipated someone coming for the cargo tonight. "You're going to want to move," said a voice from his left. He turned. Ada Wong was leaning against the wheel housing of the front truck with the kind of posture that suggested she'd been standing there for a while and found it mildly interesting. "Overwatch," he said. "2 of them. East crane 40 meters. The second one you haven't found yet is on the roof of the warehouse behind you." She checked something on her phone. "You have about 30 seconds before the column gets a go order and all 3 trucks leave simultaneously. Which one is real?" She looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for questions she found both obvious and endearing. The one they're about to move most carefully. He thought about that for exactly the time it took him to register the sound of an engine note, changing the left truck, revving slightly higher. The driver getting ready. He switched angles, moving parallel to the steel rows rather than toward them, using the trailer chassis for cover, and came around the front of the leftmost truck instead of the middle one. The driver saw him. Leon was faster. He pulled the door open before the driver could lock it, had the man out of the cab and on the gravel in 4 seconds with a knee in the small of his back, the man's radio in his hand. The radio was already transmitting. Someone on the other end saying, "Unit 3 confirms status." Leon keyed it. "Unit 3 is unavailable." Silence for 2 seconds. Then the Overwatch opened up properly, no longer trying to be precise, just trying to suppress. Leon dragged the driver behind the front wheel housing as rounds came in from 2 angles, pinging off the gravel and the trailer frame. Ada appeared on his right, coming around the front of the truck in a crouch, grappling gun already retracted. "The warehouse roof," he said. "Handled?" He didn't ask how. "Left truck, is the payload in there? Part of it?" She took the radio from his hand, listened for 2 seconds, and gave it back. They split the transfer. Biological material is in the left box. Command hardware is in the middle. The routing data, the actual map to the mountain, is being carried by a person, not a crate. Where? That's the question, isn't it? She moved toward the back of the left trailer. Open it.
What's on?
The man inside was not what Leon expected. He was sitting on a crate in the corner, with his hands flat on his knees, dressed in civilian clothes, a laptop bag between his feet. Mid-30s wire-framed glasses, the kind of face that spent most of its time looking at screens. He had a bruise on his jaw that was about 6 hours old, and a split lip that was newer than that. Someone had already found him once tonight. "I know who you are," the man said. His English was accented Croatian, or close to it. "Jill Valentine sent you." "Close enough," Leon said. "You're the engineer." "My name is Kovac. I designed the signal architecture for Black Archive's Eastern Network. The command layer, the routing, the failsafes." He looked at his hands. "I also built the door that turns it off." Leon glanced at Ada. Ada was looking at Kovac with the careful measuring attention she brought to anything that might be simultaneously valuable and dangerous. "Why are you in a container?" Leon asked. "Because Black Archive decided I knew too much and stopped being useful at the same time." Kovac touched the bruise on his jaw. "I had 48 hours of warning. I took what I could carry and I ran." He looked up. "The routing data is on this drive." He pulled a small drive from his jacket pocket. "I can also tell you exactly how to shut the command layer down if you get inside the mountain facility. But I cannot tell you that in a freight yard at 3 in the morning while people are shooting." "Fair point." Leon pulled him to his feet. "Stay behind me. Don't stop moving." Getting Kovac out of the freight yard took 11 minutes and more running than Leon would have preferred. The organization had a third ground team that neither he nor Ada had accounted for 4 men disciplined using the steel rows for cover exactly the way Leon was. He took 2 of them down, with a combination of the yard's geography and the fact that in close quarters between metal walls, a roundhouse kick to a man's weapon arm was faster than a drawn gun. The other 2 retreated, rather than pressing the engagement once they lost numbers, which told Leon they had standing orders not to lose personnel unnecessarily. Not standard mercenary behavior. Standard organization behavior. He got Kovacs over the perimeter fence with Ada covering the rear and jogged 2 blocks north to where he'd left the vehicle. Kovac breathing hard, laptop bag clutched to his chest. "The middle unit," Leon said to Ada once they were moving. "The hardware. Is it already gone?" "Left the yard 4 minutes ago," she said. She was looking at her phone again, tracking something Leon guessed that she hadn't mentioned yet. Different road than the left truck would have taken. They planned for someone to follow the biological payload and let the device move clean. "So we have Kovac and his drive. What do you have?" She looked at him sideways. "Something I haven't decided what to do with yet." That was Ada, for she had the path or the device or something that would matter later, and she was currently calculating what holding it was worth versus what sharing it would cost. Leon had known her long enough to understand that pressing the question would produce nothing except a better constructed deflection. "Kovac," he said instead. "The mountain facility." "What is it?" Kovac had stopped breathing hard. He sat in the back seat with his hand still on the laptop bag and looked out the window at the city passing in the dark. "It is the last step. Everything they built, the command layer, the carrier network, the signal distribution. It all runs on scattered nodes right now. Unstable. Requires constant management." He paused. "The mountain facility is where they plan to consolidate everything into a single, integrated system. Once it's complete, the network won't need management anymore. It will run itself." He looked at the back of Leon's head. "There is a sequence, a shutdown window that only exists during the final integration process. Before it completes, the whole system can be killed from the inside. After it completes, you would need to physically destroy every locus simultaneously. How long is the window? 12 hours from the moment integration begins. Maybe less. Kovac's voice was flat. I do not know when they started. And Leon looked at the clock on the dashboard. He looked at the city. Somewhere north of them, past the harbor lights, the Doomslayer was doing whatever the Doomslayer did when nobody was watching him. And based on the 2 Black Archive monitoring posts that had gone dark in the last hour, what he did when nobody was watching was not nothing. He keyed his radio. Chris, go. I have Kovac. He's talking. The mountain facility is the integration point. Everything runs through it, and there's a shutdown window that closes once it stabilizes. He pulled onto the arterial road heading north. How much time do we have before that happens? A pause while Chris relayed to Rebecca. Then, Rebecca says the signal behavior she's been tracking shows acceleration in the last 2 hours. The carriers in the outer district are responding faster, tighter. If that's integration in progress, how long? She says 18 hours, maybe less. Another pause. Leon. 2 more monitoring posts went dark in the last 40 minutes. Whatever's moving north of the harbor, it's cutting them off one by one. Leon thought about a system trying to complete its final integration, while the thing that wanted to destroy it was walking toward its front door. It's racing, he said. They're trying to finish before he gets there. Chris's voice came back quieter. Then we need to get there first. In the back seat, Kovac said nothing. He held the laptop bag and watched Veltrak disappear behind them, and thought about the door he'd built and whether there was still time to use it. Ada had been gone for 6 blocks when Leon noticed she'd left something on the passenger's seat. A folded piece of paper. On it, in her handwriting, a set of coordinates and a single line, the hardware from the middle truck. It will be at this location in 4 hours. What you do with it is your business. Below that smaller, the path data on Kovac's drive is real. I verified it. You're welcome. No signature. He hadn't expected one. He pocketed the paper and drove north, Kovac asleep in the back seat. With exhaustion, the city thinning out around them as the road climbed toward the dark ring of hills beyond the harbor. Somewhere in those hills, a mountain facility was trying to become the brain of every biological weapon the organization had ever built. And somewhere between Leon's vehicle and that mountain, something in Praetor armor was already moving through the night with the same destination and considerably less patience for the scenic road. The eastern substation served 9 city blocks, and the road that ran between them, the only 4-lane corridor between the harbor district and the civilian collection point at the Veltrak Sports Complex. At 0510, Black Archives coordinated units took it. Chris got the report while he was pulling Martinez off a carrier that had its hands around the man's throat. He finished that first, then read the message. Substation seized. 40+ infected, holding the perimeter. Power grid for Eastern District compromised. Evacuation route Corridor 3 impassable. He looked at the map on his wrist display. 4,000 civilians moving through Corridor 3. 2 BSAA elements on the far side of it. The substation was a choke point he hadn't protected because taking a power station hadn't been in any doctrine for handling a biological outbreak. It was in doctrine for handling a military operation. Martinez, get up. He hauled the man to his feet. The escape line is cut. We're going to the station. And what they found at the eastern station was not a mob. A mob moved the way mobs moved, forward, hungry, loud, without structure. What was holding the perimeter moved in blocks. There were units at each approach, 4 to 6 deep, not pressing forward, just occupying. There were units on the roof of the main transformer building. There were units in the access passage between the fence and the street, positioned exactly where they would need to be, to slow any approach from the west. Chris watched from the corner of a shuttered machine parts supplier 1 block out and counted firing angles. Behind him, Reyes and Torres were doing the same from the opposite corner. Across the street, Vasquez had the elevated position on a loading dock roof. "They're not attacking," Torres said quietly. "They don't need to." Chris watched a cluster of 4 drift slowly to fill a gap that had opened on the south approach. "They just need to hold it." He keyed his radio. "Jill." "Already on it?" Her voice was steady. 3 more confirmed fuel depot on Markov Street water pumping relay near the hospital crane controls at Pier 7. All within a 12-minute window. Chris processed that. Not random. Simultaneous strikes across infrastructure, all of them targeting points that either enabled evacuation or enabled BSAA to move heavy resources. Someone had mapped the city's load-bearing joints and hit them all at once. "They're pinning us," he said. "Pinning and bleeding. Every unit we send to one of those sites is a unit not pushing toward the mountain." A pause. "Chris, I've got a read on which of the 4 matters most. The substation is real. It's blocking your biggest civilian corridor. The others are decoys to split your response. Hit the substation, hold the other 3 with minimum personnel. Don't chase anything else." He was already moving. "What's Slayer doing?" "Nothing we can see directly, but 3 Black Archive logistics posts north of the harbor have gone quiet in the last 20 minutes. They're pulling their outer coverage inward." Another pause, which might be why they moved on infrastructure now. "They're losing their buffer, and they need us busy." Taking the substation back took 31 minutes. Not because of the numbers, the infected around the perimeter were formidable, but not unbreakable, and Chris had trained people. It took 31 minutes because they were fighting something that adapted mid-engagement. The cluster on the south approach held position until Chris's team committed to it, then collapsed inward, drawing them in while the roof unit came down the east stairwell to cut their rear angle. A feint. Not elegant, but functional enough that Torres took a hit to the shoulder before they recalibrated and adjusted the approach. Chris took the stairwell himself. 3 infected at the top, positioned at the landing, 1 immediately at the door. The door one came first, and fast he turned the grab into a lock, drove his combat knife through the joint at the elbow, stripped the limb and used the thing's own momentum to put it into the second one. Then drove through all 3 with enough force and speed that by the time the 4th registered what was happening, it registered it from the floor. The transformer hall was clear. He got Martinez to the main control panel to restore power while Reyes held the passage below. Martinez had his hands on the switches for 11 seconds before a carrier came through the east wall vent, the door. The vent, which meant it had been waiting in the ductwork and hit him from the side. Chris crossed the room in 3 steps, got between Martinez and the thing, and drove it into the transformer housing hard enough to crack the casing. Martinez stayed on the panel. His hands were shaking, but he stayed on it. Power came back at 0541. 40 seconds later, the evacuation traffic was moving again. Chris stood on the roof and looked at the city. In the east, the blocks that had gone dark were still dark. The grid damage had been selective, hitting residential feeds while leaving the main road intact. That was not accidental. Someone had told them exactly which breakers to trip. He thought about what Rebecca had said 2 hours ago before the infrastructure hit started. She had been watching the signal data from her portable unit at the BSAA forward post, and she'd found something in the timing that she'd made him stop and listen to before he moved his team out. "The coordinated response isn't running at full capacity," she'd said. "The signal is widening, more coverage, more units receiving commands, but the response latency is increasing. Each time it extends to a new area, the instructions get slightly slower." She'd pulled up the chart pointing to the delay curves. A system this size wasn't designed to run at full spread. The original build was for a controlled outbreak, one city clean parameters. What they're doing now is stretching it to cover both offensive action and final integration at the mountain simultaneously. Which means it's stressed. Which means it's making trade-offs. Every carrier it dedicates to holding infrastructure here is a carrier not feeding combat data back to the mountain. Every minute it spends managing this city's grid is a minute of overhead it's not spending on completion. She'd looked at him directly. And every outpost that goes quiet north of here, every link they lose, reduces the quality of what the mountain is getting. The process will finish, but it will finish with gaps. Gaps are good.
Masal.
Gaps are the only thing Kovac's shutdown sequence needs to find its way in. She'd folded the portable unit closed. But they know that. They know they're stretched, and they're trying to buy the mountain enough time to stabilize before it matters. He'd taken that with him when he left. He was still carrying it. His radio crackled. Leon's voice. Kovac finished walking me through the shutdown architecture. There are 3 trigger points inside the mountain facility, physical inputs, not digital, which means you need someone inside to reach them. All 3 have to be hit within a 60-second span, or the sequence aborts. How hard is the approach? Kovac says the internal layout is a single primary access corridor going down 2 levels, then it opens into the integration chamber. One way in, which also means one way out. A pause. He's also saying the merge window is narrowing faster than he projected. 18 hours was a best case. He's revising to 12, maybe 10. Chris checked his watch. It was 05:47. How much time until we can move on the mountain? Jill needs 2 more hours to confirm the route. Rebecca needs to finish her neutralization sequence for the carrier regeneration chains, or whatever we trigger at the mountain comes back. Leon's voice was even the tone of someone used to being told there wasn't enough time. So we're looking at moving at earliest in 3 hours, assuming nothing else goes wrong. Things will go wrong. Yeah. A beat. I know. Elena Varga had given the order at 0448, and she had not revisited it since, because revisiting orders after giving them was a habit she had spent 6 years removing from her decision process. The order had been designate 3 field units as fixed position sacrifice assets to hold the BSA-A response on the infrastructure targets until 0600. No withdrawal authorized, no communication after deployment. The operations lead had taken 4 seconds longer than usual to confirm the order. She had noted that. She had also noted that she didn't intend to address it. What she was addressing instead was the updated projection on her screen, which showed completion at 61% and decelerating. The deceleration was coming from 2 sources: reduced data feed quality, as the extended reach thinned, and the overhead of managing the city engagement simultaneously. The thing that was killing her perimeter feed was not the BSAA. She watched a new post go dark on her map, a forward logistics hub, north of the harbor, the 4th in 90 minutes. The BSAA didn't move that fast. The BSAA didn't move with that kind of target priority, taking out only the posts that fed timing and coverage data to the mountain, rather than the ones that were actively engaging their personnel. The thing moving north of the harbor was not fighting her city operation. It was surgically removing her ability to give the mountain enough time. Director? The operations lead again. The entity has entered the secondary depot cluster near the rail approach. We have 4 units in that position. She already knew what the next line would be. Contact lost with all 4. She looked at the percentage. 61. She needed 80 before the system could sustain itself without what remained outside. At current rate of attrition, she would not reach 80 before it was gone. which meant she had to accelerate the final stage by reducing the load allocated to the city engagement, which meant pulling her coordinated units back from active operations and letting the BSAA reclaim the infrastructure, which meant giving up the breathing room she'd bought. She did not allow herself to frame it as a loss. She framed it as a reallocation. "Begin recall on all city-side coordinated units," she said. "Pull everything back to the mountain perimeter. No staged withdrawal, full recall immediate." She closed the projection window. "And accelerate the process. Override the stability protocols and push it." The operations lead turned. "Director, overriding the stability protocols at this stage increases the risk of cascade failure during—" "I know what it increases the risk of." Her voice didn't change. "Do it!" He turned back to his board. She looked at the map, at the dark spots where her posts had been, at the percentage ticking upward now as the load shifted, at the line of travel that the dark spots traced north and steady, not rushing, not varying the way. Something moved when it had done this before in different hells against different things that thought they could outlast it. She pulled up the mountain facility schematics and began reviewing the internal defensive positions, not because she expected them to matter, because preparation was the only discipline that had never failed her, and she was not going to stop now. Chris got the report at 06:12. The coordinated units holding the infrastructure targets were withdrawing. All 4 sites simultaneously, a command decision, not a response to pressure. Voluntary. He stood on the roof and watched the southern approach clear as the infected simply turned and moved away, back toward the hills, back toward the northern perimeter where the mountain sat behind its dark tree line. Martinez came up beside him. "Are they retreating?" "No." Chris watched the last of them go. "They're concentrating." He keyed his radio, all channels. "All BSAA elements, listen up. Enemy has broken off city engagement and is pulling toward the northern perimeter. This is not a victory. They've shifted to protecting the objective. We have a gap before they complete whatever they're building up there, and it is closing." He looked north. "Corridor 3 is open. Get the civilians through, then regroup at the forward post. We move in 3 hours." Yes, nobody had a question. The city was still burning in 3 places. The harbor lights were on. The sports complex was lit up like a beacon generator, running 4,000 people still waiting inside, still with somewhere to be. Somewhere to the north, the Doomslayer was working through what remained of Black Archive's logistics chain. Not hurrying, not varying, just continuing the way weather continues. The way something continues when stopping has never been part of what it is. Black Archive had decided walls in depth and a process 61% complete could outlast that. Chris pulled his rifle and started down the stairs. 3 hours, maybe less. The mountain road began 3 kilometers north of Veltrak's last building and climbed through switchbacks cut into pine-covered rock. It was the only road. Black Archive had chosen the facility's location, knowing that one approached defensible at every turn with enough elevation that anything coming up it could be seen long before it arrived. Jill Valentine had been looking at the satellite overlay for 40 minutes, and she had found the problem with that logic. "They built the junction at the first switchback," she said. "Not at the site, not at the midpoint. At the first switchback 2 kilometers below the entrance." She traced the structure on the tablet screen. Concrete blast-rated walls, utility lines running up the mountain to what was above. That's not a defensive position. That's a power and sink node. They put it there because the mountain's own rock interferes with the synchronization above a certain elevation. The station compensates. Leon looked at the image. So the site needs the junction to keep the process running. It needs it to keep the process stable. Without it, the feed degrades. The process continues, but the synchronization drifts. She lowered the tablet. Rebecca, how much drift before the shutdown sequence can find a foothold? Rebecca's voice came over the radio from the forward position below. Based on what Kovacs gave me, the timing architecture runs on a 60 Hz lock. If that lock slips even 2 or 3 cycles, the shutdown window doesn't open wider, but the internal authentication resets. Kovacs' sequence can insert during a reset. A pause. We don't need to destroy the station. We need to interrupt it. Even a few seconds of dead feed might be enough. How few? 4 to 6 seconds, maybe less. Jill studied the map, the station's position on the first bend, 2 kilometers of switchback between here and the entrance above it, and the thermal layer, showing Black Archive personnel holding the road above the junction and a second layer at the gate itself. We don't have to go through them to reach the entrance, she said. We go through the station, interrupt the feed, and let Kovacs' sequence do the rest from outside. She looked at Leon. 1 push. The junction only. Then we pull back and wait for the sequence. Leon thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to check his magazine. What's Chris doing with the lower road? Holding it against whatever Black Archive sends back down when we move. So, if we don't get through the station fast, he's holding alone. He knows. They moved at 07:14. The switchback road was cold and wet. Rain had stopped an hour ago, but the rock was still slick. The pine trees, dripping onto the gravel, visibility cut to 40 meters by the mist that had settled into the valley below. Jill took point with Leon on her right and 2 BSAA operators, Haber and Singh, covering the rear. Black Archive had a 2-person observation post on the road bend before the junction. Jill saw the heat signatures on her scanner 20 meters out and took the left one herself, left Leon the right. Neither post made noise. The station's door was steel-reinforced card access with a secondary keypad she hadn't been able to see on the satellite image. The first bypass took 18 seconds and hit the backup layer. She reset, pulled a secondary tool from her kit, and got through in another 29:47 total. Not clean, but done. Inside a narrow equipment passage, server racks along one wall. The routing hardware in a sealed cabinet at the far end, cooling units running loud enough to cover movement. A 3-person Black Archive security team was inside. They were good professional response covered angles. One of them got a shot off that clipped Haber's vest plate before Leon took the shooter's footing out from under him with a heel sweep and finished it in the same motion. Jill put down the second. The third backed toward the routing cabinet, not reaching for a weapon, reaching for a panel on the side, housing fingers, finding something that looked like an emergency lockout. Singh hit him low before the fingers closed. Leon secured the arm. The lockout stayed untouched. 58 seconds from entry to clear. Jill moved to the routing cabinet. The hardware inside was exactly what Kovac had described. A signal amplifier running a hardwired lock to what was above a backup power unit and a manual interrupt switch that existed as a safety measure and that no one had apparently considered a threat vector. She keyed her radio. Kovac! Leon held the radio out. Kovac's voice slightly hoarse. I'm here. Manual interrupt on the routing cabinet. Single switch red housing. Activating it will drop the feed for how long before the backup initializes? A brief pause. The backup takes 8 seconds to synchronize, maybe 9. The original build had a 6-second delay, but Elena's team modified the hardware twice. I don't know exactly what the current gap is, between 4 and 9. That's a wide range. I know. I'm sorry. Jill looked at the switch in its red housing, at the cable running through the concrete ceiling toward the mountain above, and made her decision. Good enough, she said and threw it. 800 meters below on the lower approach road, Chris Redfield heard the signal drop in the most direct way available. The Black Archive kill team that had been holding a disciplined line 50 meters ahead of him suddenly stopped being disciplined. The coordinated pressure they'd been maintaining measured advances cover fire. Deliberate positioning stuttered. Two of them hesitated. One turned its head the wrong direction. For 3 seconds, it was like watching a marionette whose strings had gone slightly slack. 3 seconds was enough. He pushed his team through the gap before the signal stabilized, drove the kill team's center apart with enough force and momentum that by the time whatever was synchronizing them caught up, they were already in positions that didn't support the formation they'd been holding. After that, it was attrition, and attrition on an open road favored the side with the trained people. He heard Jill's voice on the radio when the last of them went down. "Lower road clear. Clear." He was breathing harder than he'd like. Martinez was pressing a field dressing to his forearm, a slash from something he hadn't seen fast enough, not deep, but bleeding freely in the cold. "Signal interruption worked. They fell apart. We're at the junction. Kovac's sequence is running." A pause. "It needs 3 minutes. Hold the road." Chris looked at the road, the tree line above it, the mist swallowing everything past 60 meters. "Holding." The sequence ran for 3 minutes and 40 seconds before Kovac said quietly, "It's in." Leon was watching the door. Jill was watching the routing cabinet's indicator lights. When the authentication reset light went from red to amber to green, in a sequence that Kovac had described, but that none of them had been certain they'd actually see, there was a moment of silence in the relay station that had a specific texture, the kind that comes right before something either works or catastrophically doesn't. Then Rebecca's voice on the radio. "I'm reading a change in the pattern from out here. The synchronization lock is degraded. It's not broken, but it's..." She stopped. "It's like the system is running on a cracked foundation. Completion is still progressing, but Kovac's sequence is in the substrate. When someone hits those 3 trigger points inside, it will have something to lock on to." "Time estimate on completion reaching critical threshold?" Jill asked. "Current rate 2 hours. Maybe less if Elena pushes the override again." 2 hours. Jill looked at the road map. 2 kilometers of switchback above them, a kill layer at the entrance. And whatever was inside that, they hadn't mapped yet. She thought about Kovac's description single access passage 2 levels down the integration chamber at the bottom. 1 way in. Leon, already thinking about it. 3 trigger points, 60-second window, 1 passage. She folded the map. "We need Chris to open the entrance layer, then we go straight down." Leon looked at the secured Black Archive guard sitting against the far wall. Then, at the door. "What about Ada?" As if in answer, his phone lit up. A text message, no contact name. Buyer network closed. No external rescue coming for the mountain. 1 shard retained, not enough to rebuild. "You're welcome. Don't look for me." Leon read it twice. Then he held it up for Jill to see. She read it once. She took something. She always takes something. Is what she left us enough? Leon pocketed the phone. Ask me after. Elena Varga saw the Predator suit on camera at 0741. Exterior camera 7 northeast, perimeter motion triggered. The footage lasted 4 seconds before the camera went offline. Not destroyed, she noted, simply bypassed, which was a level of precision that told her the entity had dealt with surveillance systems before and understood the difference between removing a camera and removing a record. 4 seconds of footage. She had it on her screen now, running on loop, the way she had once watched 41 seconds of assembly floor footage until she understood what she was looking at. What she saw in 4 seconds was this: that the Predator suit was moving without urgency. Not slowly, the stride length was significant, covering ground efficiently. But there was no visible acceleration, no reaction to the perimeter alert that her system had triggered when the camera activated. It moved the way something moved when it had already accounted for the perimeter and found it irrelevant. Exterior camera 7 was 400 meters from the entrance. She looked at the completion percentage. 73. The degraded feed from the junction interruption had cost her 11 points and 2 of the stability locks she'd been using to maintain synchronization. She could push to recover them, but recovering them would require routing through the site's internal systems, which meant the process would draw from the integration chamber itself, which meant she could not wait any longer. She had known this moment was coming. She had modeled it, wargamed it, prepared the contingency. She had simply not allowed herself to think too carefully about what the contingency required. The host prime protocol existed because Elena understood that distributed systems failed at their edges. A network needed a stable center, something that could not be disrupted because it was not a separate node to be isolated, but a living part of the architecture itself. The protocol required a human interface, a voluntary host who would allow the command layer to route through their nervous system and use their biological processing capacity to stabilize the process at the final threshold. She had always intended to be that host herself. She had told herself this was because she was the most qualified. She had told herself this was because she trusted no one else with that kind of access. She pulled up the protocol interface and set her handprint to the scanner. The operations lead turned when he heard the authorization tone. His face did something she did not look at closely. "Director, prepare the integration chamber," she said. "Send the remaining personnel to defensive positions, full perimeter. Nothing gets into that passage." She stood. "I'll be in the chamber." She walked out of the command vehicle and did not look back at the city behind her. She had not looked at it since the night began. She was not going to start now. Jill heard the report from the last working exterior camera at 0748. The defensive layer had reinforced all remaining personnel pulling inward to the entrance and the passage beyond. No outward pressure, no kill team coming down the road. They weren't trying to stop the approach anymore. They were guarding something inside. She keyed her radio. "Chris, we're moving up. How long can you hold the lower road?" "Long enough." His voice was even. "Go." She signaled Leon. Leon signaled Haber and Singh. They started up the switchback, 2 kilometers of wet rock and cold air. Above them, Elena Varga was walking into a room to become something she could not walk back from. Below and behind the Praetor suit was covering the remaining 400 meters with the same unhurried stride it had used on everything else. Jill did not know if they would reach the trigger points in time. She knew they would reach them before she stopped moving. That would have to be enough. The integration locus was 40 meters below the mountain surface, at the end of a descent that passed through 2 reinforced blast doors, and a kill corridor Black Archive had designed for exactly this kind of last stand. The room itself was circular, 15 meters across, with the processing structure built into the walls, not rack-mounted, not modular, grown into the concrete over 3 years like roots into stone. At its center, the host cradle. Elena Varga had been in the cradle for 11 minutes, when the first of Jill's team reached the upper blast door. She was aware of them. She was aware of everything the facility's remaining sensors could detect: 14 warm signatures moving through the descent from above, and something larger and colder and more deliberate coming from the northeast through walls that should have stopped it and had not. She was aware of Chris Redfield holding the entrance level above, with 4 people against what her coordinated units were throwing at it, and of the signal degradation the insertion was producing in her peripheral systems, small glitches, sub-second the kind that a distributed network could absorb. For now. She was also aware that she was no longer entirely the person who had walked into the room. The cradle's interface had taken 17 minutes to complete the initial connection. She had not screamed. She had decided some years ago that certain responses were not productive, and pain was a response like any other. What she had not anticipated was not the pain, but the expansion, the sense of the network opening into her, like a second set of lungs, every carrier's position, a pressure, every signal, a breath, every dead node, a held note that simply ceased. She could feel the 400 meters of mountain above her. She could feel the city below the parts of it that still had coordinated units functioning. She could feel the thing that had been killing her network for 2 days. It was very close. The upper blast door had been designed to take 40 minutes of sustained breaching. Jill got it open in 11 using a sequence Kovac had provided from memory. Not the override code, but the maintenance access that predated the facility's operational lockdown. The kind of access that exists in every system, because systems must be maintained, and the people who maintain them need a way in when primary access fails. Inside the kill corridor, 40 meters of steel-plated hall with firing positions cut into the walls at every third panel. 8 black archive personnel, disciplined and expecting them. Left wall low, she said, and went right. Leon was already moving. Haber went center to pull fire. Singh took the first firing position at 8 meters and held it long enough for the formation to collapse. The fight in the corridor lasted 90 seconds and left 3 of the 8 positions permanently vacated and Haber with a round through his right hand that he dealt with by switching his weapon to his left and not stopping. Rebecca behind Leon had her kit out before they reached the second blast door. She field-wrapped Haber's hand while Leon held the door position. 30 seconds, she said. He gave her 35 as. The second door was mechanical fail-safe power independent, keyed to a physical combination. Kovac had to recite twice before he got it right, his hands shaking enough that Leon steadied them without comment. The door opened onto the descent to the locus below. Rebecca went still. The air from below was not cold the way mountain air was cold. It was cold the way a server room was cold. Maintained intentional, the byproduct of systems running very hard at very controlled temperatures, and underneath that, something organic. Not rot, not decay. The smell of something alive doing something it was not built to do. She's already in, Rebecca said. How far? Jill asked. Rebecca looked at her portable unit. The signal from below was not a standard pathogen pattern anymore. It was partially biological, partially electronic, the 2 signatures interfering with each other in ways that made her scanner produce readings it didn't have vocabulary for. Far enough that this looks different from anything in the database. She closed the unit. Move fast. At the entrance level, Chris Redfield was losing ground. Not catastrophically, he knew the difference between losing ground and losing position. And he was losing the first while holding the second. The kill team that had hit the entrance 20 minutes ago had been replaced by a second wave that was larger and coordinating differently than anything he'd seen in the city. Tighter spacing, quicker to fill gaps. Whatever was below had been given more direct access to the remaining units and was using it. Martinez was down, not dead, ankle-crushed when a carrier took him from the side, now propped against the entrance wall, with a handgun and a clear line of sight to the approach. Torres was on his right, bleeding from a gash above the ear. Reyes was covering the left approach, the only one of them who hadn't taken a hit yet, which Chris attributed to either skill or debt not yet called in. He drove the center of the current push back with his rifle and his body and the corner of a reinforced blast panel he'd torn free from the wall. And for a moment the entrance was clear, and in that moment he keyed his radio. Jill, tell me you're close. Second level, 1 door left. I need 10 more minutes. A pause that told him she was calculating, not hesitating. You'll have them. He looked at Martinez, at Torres, at Reyes. At the 4 meters of entrance, he was holding with 3 functional people, and one who was holding anyway. "Copy," he said. The Doomslayer came through the northeast wall of the integration locus 7 minutes before Jill's team reached the lower door. The wall was rated for anti-vehicle impact. It had held that rating until it didn't, and then it was a hole in the concrete through which the Predator suit moved, without adjusting its pace. The way water moves through a gap, not rushing, simply arriving at whatever was on the other side. What was on the other side was Host Prime. It saw him immediately. She saw him. The distinction was becoming academic. The carrier units inside oriented as one, a half-dozen bodies that had been positioned as close-range defenders, and they moved in the coordinated way that made them more than the sum of their parts. 3 from the left, 3 from the right, time to overlap his response window. He responded to all 6 in under 4 seconds. The Doomblade took 2. The super shotgun addressed the rest, with the efficiency of something that had been solving exactly this category of problem for a very long time. Then, there was only the cradle and what was in it. Elena Varga Host Prime was recognizable. That was the first thing. She had not dissolved into the structure the way a mold-connected host dissolved or fragmented the way a parasite stage subject fragmented. She was still a person, and a cradle still had a face. Still had the precise, controlled posture she had maintained in every footage frame he'd studied. What was different, her thorax had been opened. Not violently, the integration was surgical planned, something she had agreed to in every technical sense of the word. The chest cavity had been restructured as a relay hub, ribs repositioned to accommodate the interface hardware that now ran through her sternum and connected to the room's processing structure through channels that were neither wire nor nerve, but something built from both. Neural tissue had been externalized along her upper spine, drawn out in dense bundles that ran to contact points in the cradle wall, pulsing with signal traffic that made them move like breathing. Her eyes were open. "You're earlier than my projection," she said. Her voice came from her own throat, but the cadence was slightly wrong, modulated by the process running through her as if each word had to pass through a second filter before exiting. "I had calculated 40 minutes before breach." He took in the channels running along her spine, the contact points in the cradle wall, the 3 years of biological structure grown into the concrete like something planted rather than built. He did not answer her. "The insertion is in the foundation," she said. "I know. I can feel it. It's finding the gaps the signal drift created." A pause, not human hesitation, but processing load. "It won't matter. The integration is past the threshold. What's running through me now will sustain the network regardless of what it finds. The process is complete enough to..." He moved. She had time to redirect 4 of the 6 remaining units before he was at the first conduit bank. 2 of them hit him not hard enough to matter, but enough to slow the first strike by a fraction of a second, which was probably what she had calculated she needed. She had not calculated the crucible. The first bank came apart at the connection point, and through the open thorax, through the relay hub, that her rib cage had become. Elena Varga felt the loss, the way a person feels a severed limb. A gap where signal had been a silence in the network that the remaining structure scrambled to absorb. Her voice, when she spoke again, was still controlled. "That will not stop it. I've overridden the stability locks. The process self-sustains now, regardless of second junction." The silence in the network was larger this time. The recovery response was slower. In the facility's remaining systems, 2 floors above what Kovac had built, found the gap it had been waiting for, and inserted a cascade that Rebecca Chambers, descending toward the lower door, felt as a change in the signal output on her portable unit. An instability she'd been watching for since Kovac first described the timing logic. "It's working," she said. Not loudly. just enough for Jill to hear.
Tatan.
Jill heard it. She also heard the sound from behind the chamber door. Not an impact, not an alarm, but something that had no clean category. The sound of a system being taken apart by something that understood systems at a level the system's designers had not planned for. She had the lower door's mechanical release identified. 3-point physical lock keyed to a sequence same maintenance access logic as the second blast door. Kovac was behind her, Leon behind him, Rebecca and Haber at the rear, with Haber's left hand still functional and his right wrapped and useless, and his expression indicating he did not intend to discuss either of those facts. "Kovac," she said. He gave her the sequence. She had the door open in 40 seconds. Inside the room and what the room held. Rebecca stopped moving when she saw Elena. Not from fear, she had seen things in 14 years of fieldwork that had rearranged her understanding of what human bodies could become. She stopped because she needed a moment to understand what she was looking at before she could respond to it correctly. The open thorax, the dense bundles along the spine, the contact points in the cradle wall still pulsing with whatever signal traffic the remaining structure was carrying. Elena's face still recognizable, still composed, still, and this was the part Rebecca needed a moment for, still thinking. This was what the research had been for. This was the culmination of every paper on neurological signal routing she had read, every sample she had analyzed, every coordination mechanism she had traced through tissue and data. The science had been real. The science had worked. And a person had used it to do this to herself deliberately on purpose, in the name of a philosophy that Rebecca had heard articulated at careful remove, and that she now understood looking at the cradle at the level of preparation this had required, had never been abstract at all. Elena had always planned to end up here. She had built this room for herself. "Close the door," Jill said. Rebecca closed it. "Tasana." The Doomslayer had reached the third and final conduit array when Host Prime did something unexpected. She stopped trying to stop him. The remaining units in the chamber went still, not incapacitated, just ordered to hold. And Elena Varga, through the voice that was hers, and not hers, said something she had decided was worth saying before the last junction came apart. "You're not here to save them." Not an accusation, an observation in the same tone she might have used to note that the weather had changed. Every outbreak that comes after this, and there will be more. There are always more, will be chaos. Uncoordinated, wasteful, killing because that's what uncontrolled systems do. The lines along her spine pulsed. I was going to give that chaos a nervous system, control, efficiency. A world where the next outbreak doesn't surprise anyone because it can't, because it's already integrated, already managed. Her eyes tracked him without moving. "You're going to destroy that. I accept that. But I want you to know what you're preserving instead." He looked at what she had become, the careful, deliberate construction of it, the face still entirely, Elena Varga reasoning clearly, certain of her own correctness to the last possible moment. He drove the crucible through the third junction. The silence in the network was total. Through the walls, through the facility above, through whatever remained of the carrier network, what Kovac had built found the space it needed and began to run. Rebecca's portable unit registered the cascade in real time, not a clean shutdown, not yet, but a progressive instability moving through what ran beneath faster than the remaining structure could hold against. Host Prime was still alive, still connected, still trying to route signal through lines that were no longer intact, her body's remaining biological systems pushing back with increasing desperation against losses the engineering had not been designed to survive. "She's not done," Leon said from beside Jill. He was watching the cradle, watching the pulsing, that hadn't stopped the thorax relay still cycling through some residual traffic that the cascade hadn't reached yet. "The cascade needs to finish propagating," Rebecca said. She was at Jill's shoulder watching her unit. "It's moving. It'll reach the final integration in..." She stopped, watched the numbers. Minutes, maybe less. "But if the remaining structure holds before it gets there, then we give it less time to hold," Jill said. She looked at the trigger points Kovac had described. 3 physical inputs, 60-second window, all 3 required. They were distributed across the walls. She could see 2 of them now. The interface panels Kovac had described, slightly different from the standard structure in ways that were only obvious if you knew what you were looking for. The 3rd was behind the cradle, behind Host Prime. She looked at the Doomslayer who was standing at the center of the room with the crucible in his hand, looking at what remained of Elena Varga with the specific attention he gave to things that were not yet finished. She looked at the 2 trigger panels she could reach. "I can hit 2, she said. "Leon the 3rd is behind the cradle. You need to be there when I start the 60-second count." Leon looked at the cradle, at the line still pulsing between Elena's spine and the wall, at the thing at the room's center, neither ally nor obstacle, just a force moving in the same direction as the truth. "I'll be there," he said. Above them, Chris Redfield held the entrance. He held it with Torres, who was down to 1 good eye and still shooting. With Reyes, who had finally collected on that debt and was bleeding from the shoulder but hadn't moved from position. With Martinez, who had dragged himself 3 meters along the entrance wall to a better angle and was making every shot count because he no longer had the option of wasting any. The coordinated push against the entrance had changed character in the last 2 minutes, less organized, the tight spacing beginning to loosen the gap-filling response, slowing. Something below had changed, and whatever it was had reached the carrier network through the command layer and made it less than it had been. Chris didn't know what was happening below. He knew that the door was still open behind him, and that nobody had come back through it, and that as long as nobody had come back through it, he was doing the right thing. He drove the blast panel into the center of the current line and held. The entrance held. Below, the cascade ran through Host Prime's foundation, finding purchase in the gaps the Crucible had made, and what Kovac had built 3 years ago and spent 1 night conveying to a federal agent in a city that was no longer on fire, but was not yet saved, began to reach the final integration it had been designed to find. The lower door was still closed. The 60-second count had not yet started. Everything was still in the balance, the way things are in the last moment before they tip. Jill hit the first trigger at 000 and started the count. The panel responded with a tone that was wrong. Not the clean confirmation Kovac had described, but something fractured the 60 Hz lock already slipping from the cascade damage running through the walls. She moved to the second trigger at a dead run, crossing 15 meters of room, while Host Prime tracked her with the 7 carrier units that hadn't been destroyed, redirecting them mid-formation as if reading the geometry of the space directly through the cradle. The formation was slower than it should have been. The response lag was visible, half a second, maybe less, but enough. Behind the cradle, Leon reached the 3rd trigger. He'd gone low and fast around the outside of the room, using the cradle's mass as cover. And the 2 defenders that tried to cut him off found a sidekick and a forearm in quick succession, and the floor after that. He had his hand on the 3rd panel at 009. Jill, 021. She was at the 2nd trigger. On 3. He gave her 3. All 3 panels fired within the 60-second window. The tone that came from the walls this time wasn't fractured. It was complete, a sound that resonated through the concrete and the biological structure grown into it, and the command hardware embedded in Elena Varga's thorax, and Host Prime felt it the way she had felt the Crucible as a severing. Not of a limb this time. Of everything. The process reached the final integration layer. and the room began to die. It died the way living systems die, not all at once, but in sequence, the most peripheral parts first. The remaining units lost coordination mid-movement, becoming what they had been before the signal reached them, bodies following the last instruction they'd received, which was to close on the team, which they did. But one of them, the one that had been positioned directly between Leon and the descent, held its spacing longer than it should have some residual command loop. Keeping it locked on, and Leon put it down with 2 shots at 4 meters and kept moving with the left side of his jacket open where it had gotten a hand on him. Not deep. He didn't stop to check. The biological mass on the walls, the 3 years of structure grown into concrete, began to contract. Not violently. The way a plant dies slowly, and then fast, the tissue losing tension, the contact points in the housing going dark, one cluster at a time. Rebecca was watching her unit. "Synchronization is gone," she said. The numbers on the screen were not numbers she had seen before. They were the absence of the pattern she'd been tracking since Veltrack. It's not compensating anymore. It's not even trying. She looked up at the housing. It's dying. Host Prime was still alive. The physical systems. Elena's own biology, the parts of her that predated the cradle, were still functioning. Her lungs were moving. Her eyes were open. What was gone was the network, the pressure of every carrier's position, the breadth of every signal, the distributed weight of a system that had for 11 minutes made her something larger than a person. She was only a person now. She was still in the housing when Jill said, "The core relay." What the shutdown had started tore away enough biological mass from the cradle to expose what was underneath a compact relay core, the true synchronization anchor, smaller than anyone would have expected from a system this large, because the most important parts of complex systems usually were. "That's what the rest was protecting," Jill said. "Not to anyone in particular. Not the carrier network. Not the command layer. That." She looked at the Doomslayer, who was already looking at it. He crossed the room in 4 strides. The relay core was hardened ceramic casing, impact rated, designed to survive structural collapse, and he drove the crucible through it with enough force that the ceramic didn't crack so much as cease. And the sound that came from the walls, but dropped from a low resonance to silence so complete it had a texture. Elena Varga's body went still in the cradle. Not all at once. Biological hardware still running on residual charge. The thorax relay cycled through 3 more pulses. After the core died, still trying to fulfill a function with no network left to serve. Then that stopped too. Her eyes did not close. They stayed open and focused on the ceiling or on something past it with the specific attention of someone who had at the very last still been thinking. She had not asked for anything. She had not changed her mind. The room accepted that and let her go. What remained of the mountain facility began coming apart from the inside out. The conduit lines in the walls went first, the biological components burning off as the electrical charge routed through them. Without the temperature regulation the network had maintained. The smell was sharp and organic. Something between ozone and protein, and Rebecca pulled her collar up and kept moving. A section of the ceiling dropped 3 meters behind them. Not catastrophically, but enough to narrow the exit path to the width of 1 person at a time, and Haber went through it sideways with his wrapped right hand against the wall, and his expression indicating this was a problem he intended to have later. "Kovac!" Leon had him by the arm. "Can you run?" Kovac ran. The blast door at the top of the descent was still open. Chris had made sure of that from above, which had cost him a position and taken a round through his left arm at the bicep, not deep, but bleeding hard. And he'd held the exit with Martinez and Reyes, while Torres, one-eyed and still functional, covered the approach. When Jill's team came up through the descent with a man who had never been meant for extraction runs, Torres moved first to help Kovac over the threshold, and Martinez pulled Jill through before she had to ask. Chris counted them: Jill, Leon, Rebecca, Kovac. Haber left hand wrapped, right wrapped tighter than before. "Where's—" "Still inside," Leon said. Chris looked at the descent. At the heat coming up from it, the sound of something large, losing structural coherence below. At the closed blast door that Jill had let fall behind them when they came through, which was the right call, which he would have made himself. He sealed the surface exit and pulled his team back to the perimeter. It took 11 minutes to become unenterable. Rebecca stood at the perimeter and watched the northeast face of the mountain. 3 vents she could see from this distance showed light electrical fire, biological combustion, the integrated systems burning out on each other as the temperature regulation failed. Whatever had been stored in there for 3 years was dying in those fires. The cultured tissue and the stored data and the research that had never been meant to be found. The snow had started again. Light the kind that settled rather than fell. Somewhere inside, something broke a load-bearing element, and the northeast face shifted, not a collapse settling the mountain, taking back what had been cut into it. The light in the vents dimmed. "Sample vaults?" Jill asked. Rebecca looked at her unit. The biological signatures from inside had been going flat for 6 minutes. The last of them, the ones deepest in the facility, had gone at 0:47. Nothing viable. Whatever is still in there isn't viable. How sure? Sure enough. She thought about the contact points going dark, one cluster at a time. About what it had looked like when the cascade reached the final layer. The network needed to stay connected to keep everything viable. When the core relay went, the preservation systems went with it. She put the unit away. "It's just tissue now." Jill nodded once and didn't say anything else. Chris found him at the eastern perimeter, where the mountain road ended and the tree line began. The Predator suit was intact, scarred the way it was always scarred, which was to say heavily in ways that implied encounters that should have ended differently and hadn't. He was standing at the edge of the road with his back to what remained of the facility, and for a moment Chris thought he was simply stopped, the way a machine stops when there is no next task. Then the Doomslayer walked into the trees and was gone. No acknowledgement, no pause at the sound of footsteps. The snow closed behind him, the way it closes behind everything, without preference. Leon had come up beside Chris without him noticing. That happened sometimes with Leon. "He torched the server core," Leon said. "And the vaults. And 3 auxiliary systems I don't have names for. Everything that could have been used to start this over." He watched the tree line. "Ada's going to have a very hard time with that data shard she kept." "Good," Chris said. They stood in the snow and looked at where the Doomslayer had been and at the mountain that was no longer what it had been. Leon said after a moment, "He wasn't our ally." "No. Was he on our side?" Chris looked at the dark line of trees where something had gone that the world had no category for. At the city below, still visible from this elevation, its light still on, its people still alive in numbers that would not have been alive if the mountain had had 12 more hours. "He was on the right side," Chris said. The snow kept falling. Below, Veltrak was waking up.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.